So I've got a three-part series with the Tech Chief at INEOS, and this video is part 2 of a two-part clarification with further information provided by INEOS. We're going to go through brake traction control calibration, driving advice for INEOS owners, and INEOS's final message to the world. Then we talked about brake traction control calibration because it's really important to know how the electronics on your four-wheel drive work, because again the tiny differences can make a difference between you making it up out of an obstacle or not. And it's so important to understand this stuff down to a detailed level, and it's so hard to get reliable information out of manufacturers to explain what the differences are, so we end up having to reverse engineer this stuff. So the background here: INEOS has various modes, centre diff open, locked. How does it all change when these modes are created? So the status of ESC varies depending on whether the vehicle is in normal, off-road, with all diffs. Only with all diffs locked, that's centre, rear and front, is ESC interventions disabled. I got a clarification upon a clarification upon a clarification about this, and it is here. So the first thing to know is that INEOS used the term ESC for all of their electronic programs. So brake traction control is to them part of ESC, and it is, right, because brake traction control includes many different programs: anti-roll, engine traction control, brake traction control, ABS, you know, the whole lot is underneath there. So I guess that's logical from that perspective. However, it confused me when I was reading it because it said ESC changes. It never mentioned brake traction control or an equivalent term for it. So I would like to see them split out, because the ESC is one thing. Brake traction control can operate independently of ESC, even though it's grouped under the same point. This is the detail I'm talking about here. Anyway, there are 4 different modes of ESC. Now, when you say ESC, remember that's stability control, engine traction control, and brake traction control, and who knows what else, and also anti-roll. So that's with on-road mode, on-road, off-road mode, as well, off-road mode with the centre diff locked, and then ESC deactivated when everything's locked up. I don't know if there's a different mode for centre diff locked, and whether it's high range, low range, etc. But to be honest, I think the brake traction control, which is really what I'm most interested in here, is pretty consistent across all of those modes, certainly when the centre diff is locked, and ESC doesn't seem to get in the way. So well done INEOS for keeping the electronics out of the driver's way, which is another one of their focuses. So yeah, a bit more information there. The dual battery setup, this is another one people have got so many questions about, and during the interview I said it was a bit of a mystery, and I said, okay, what is your conceptual thinking? I'm not looking for a wiring diagram run for at this point, but what is your concept here? Because it doesn't follow the norms we would have in the aftermarket for setting up such a system. So what's the conceptual thinking was my question. So our concept supports the starter battery for better performance and cold starts. Now, I don't really think that that INEOS has a problem with starting the car on a single battery, but you know, that's their answer. Goes on to say, this means we do not have to change the wiring between the single battery and the dual battery options. Yeah, that is part of the reason people are asking questions about this and are not overly happy with it. The next one, for an isolation concept, the accessories would need then to be wired to the battery, as is typical for retrofit solutions. Yes, that is what people want. So just to be clear, the way dual batteries are normally set up is that you do not touch the original manufacturer wiring. You then add a second battery and you add additional wiring in the car. In my car, for example, I've got additional 12 volts in the front and the rear and pretty much everywhere else, and USB chargers, and then you run your fridge off that, you run your work lights, etc. So essentially you run off your dual battery, any accessory really, particularly the ones that you're going to use when stopped. That's the way you do it. So that's exactly what we actually want. Additionally, most isolation relays switch off at a certain voltage, etc., etc., and this is talking about smart alternators. So smart alternator is something brought in for fuel efficiency standards, and without going into too much detail, it sort of works, doesn't work, it's not always engaged to save a bit of fuel, and that means that the voltage charge is quite variable. So yes, that is a problem, but you know what, it's been solved for well over a decade, maybe 2 decades, DC chargers. Go see your friends at CTEC and Red Arc and whoever else, right? And just get a DC charger solves the smart alternator problem as everywhere else. And in fact, in some cases, you can actually disable a smart alternator. That's what I've done in my Ranger, for example. So this could be done, but there you go. That is INEOS's conceptual thinking behind a dual battery. Then I said, okay, what advice do you have for INEOS owners? Because every vehicle has its own specific driving techniques, and you know, you guys are from the factory, you built it. What would you say to a driver to get the absolute best out of it? So that was the background to that. What does INEOS recommend for Grenadier specific driving techniques? So the answer is, while the Grenadier doesn't have automatic off-road modes, and by the way, I don't think it needs it, I think what it has is absolutely fine. The brake traction control needs to be better, but it doesn't need off-road modes. It will automatically adjust to intervention. So it talks about ESC there as well. So that's not really what I was after. So I'm going to offer my advice to INEOS specific driving techniques instead. So let's just have a quick recap as to what we are talking about here. So we've got a 4-position transfer case. Centre diff is locked and unlocked, and it's in high range and low range, and any combination thereof. And it's all-wheel drive with that lockable centre diff. We do have brake traction control, albeit not a great calibration on the vehicle. We've got hill descent control. We've got front and rear recovery points, 2 of them front and rear. We've got optional cross-axle front and rear lockers, 17 and 18-inch wheels, so we've got high-profile tyres there with all-terrain tyres, which is fantastic. It's got a raised air intake. It's not a sealed snorkel. You should seal it, etc. And 800 millimeters wide, which is actually pretty good, but you know, don't be relying on that, because there's one thing about water crossings. Once you're in, you're committed, and once the water starts coming over the bonnet, that's when you're going to wish that you had a snorkel, not a raised air intake. There is no adaptive terrain system like terrain response. Again, I don't really think the car needs it. What it does have is off-road and wade modes. Now, the off-road mode doesn't really... It does change the ESC and all the ancillary programs, but not that I've seen to a huge degree, particularly once the centre diff is locked. But what it does do is turn off the park distance control, the engine stop start, and the seatbelt alert, which I think is great, except for the seatbelt alert. I don't see why that needs to come off. Now, it does have a wade mode, which I really like, and that turns off the engine fan, the aux fan, the DPF, sets the air circulation to internal, and I think puts on the disables or turns on the seat heating or something. So do use the wading mode if you are going to go wading, and by that I would mean anything above hub width, hub depth rather, I would be using wading mode. So good to see it's got that. All right, now let's talk about the transfer case and different terrains then as well. So the basic principle is lock the centre diff as soon as there's no risk of transmission wind-up, i.e. you are on a surface which allows the front and the rear axles to turn at different speeds. So not bitumen, even wet bitumen, don't do it there. But when you're on a gravel road, you can lock the centre diff, particularly when it starts to get rough. It's a really smooth gravel road, I wouldn't worry about it. But once you start to get to the point where it's corrugated, going around the corner, etc., I would definitely be locking up that centre diff, and certainly in any off-road terrain like sand, etc. Please do not be one of these people that tries to get as far as they can and bragging that they didn't even have to lock the centre diff. That is not cool for your car. It's not good for the environment. You just look like an idiot. Now, consider unlocked centre diff if there's risk of damage. Now, my classic case for that is campsites, and this is where vehicles like the Grenadier are really good. You can drive around a campsite and not rip up the campsite because you've got your centre diff locked, so that's handy. Also really, really good for backing heavy trailers across difficult terrain like curbs and things like that. So handy to have that mode. Now, I would keep the vehicle in low range if the speeds are under 40 kilometers an hour. Again, don't be one of those heroes that says, oh yeah, I drove this in high range. It's just not good for the car or anything else. Just, you know, if the speed's going to be under 40 k's an hour, then I would just keep it in low range. And this is really important. Now, I'm not given to sensationalism or hyperbole or melodrama, but I want to say very clearly here, if you drive a vehicle like the INEOS Grenadier on steep hills without the centre diff locked, you could potentially die. And the reasons for that I've explained in another video. Essentially, you can launch yourself up to the top of the hill, you put the brakes on, the front wheel's locked, the rear's rotate, and back you come and potentially over. And that has happened. So if there's one thing you take away from this video, lock your centre diff on steep hills. That is so critical, please. All right, now I do have a table here. I'm not going to pause talk through it. It's on a blog post. You can look at that on my website, and I'll link it up. Talk a bit about cross-axle lockers, when to use them. So they can only be engaged in low range, below 15 kilometers an hour, at less than 40% throttle, and brake traction control can't be activated. So essentially that's pretty normal, and it's good standard practice for any lockers, which is lock them before you actually need. So you're coming up to an obstacle, you look at it and go, yeah, I'm going to need a bit of traction, press the button, off you go. Don't wait till the wheels are spinning and then try and lock it. That's never been good. Brake traction control disabled on the front axle of the rear locker. That's a shame. Rear first and front, we've talked about that. Hill descent control is disabled. We've talked about that as well. And they require a wheel speed difference to unlock. So this is something really annoying. We actually talked about it in the interview as well. Essentially, you press the button and it says flash, flash, flash. So it says, I have received a command to unlock. What's going to, but it needs a difference in wheel speeds to unlock. So you've got to go round a 45-degree corner. Normally it would just unlock as you drive along, or maybe you need to do that, speed up, slow down, something like that. But in the Grenadier, it really doesn't want to turn off that light until there's a significant wheel speed difference. And I find that just really irritating, and so do a lot of other people. And they unlock at 75 kilometers an hour, but to be honest, you're really not going to need lock it at 75 kilometers an hour. Okay, when should you use them? Essentially, when one or more wheels on an axle are likely to lose traction going up or downhill. So just pop the rear in. As soon as you pop the front in, you lose a lot of steering lock. So I'd just be generally using the rear, but as a skilled four-wheel driver, you get to learn that. With the rear only, the Grenadier is actually very, very capable. And turning's restricted with the rear, but also even more with the front as well. And you do not get transmission wind up with a rear locker. It will scrunch a bit, but because with the rear locker and the front locker for that matter, you turn left, you turn right, that cancels out. With the centre, you turn left, you turn right, that's a cumulative effect. Look at my video on transmission wind up to get that explained in more detail. Okay, now this is an example of when you wouldn't be using twin lockers, and that is a situation like this. It's very muddy, you need traction, but you also want to be able to steer, and those lockers will actually restrict steering, and because it's restricting steering, that will actually create more drag, potentially bogging you or at least slowing you. And the weight on each wheel is relatively the same, particularly with the INEOS's great suspension, so I wouldn't be using front or rear lockers in this situation. And also you're not going particularly slowly, so again the brake traction control can have a chance to work there. So that's an example not to use it. This is when you would use it. This is a video that's coming up, my drive around Adelaide Hills four-wheel drive park. This vehicle had the rear locker in there, front would have helped as well. So that's a rocky climb like that, absolutely perfect for use of lockers. And if you're not going to really turn, use both, right? You only really want to put the rear in only if you're going to be turning. If it's just going to be a straight up climb, use both. And like this, for example, now this is deliberately driven without lockers in because we wanted to test it, but the wheels in the air here, this is an example of where correct driving technique, had we been doing that, you'd have popped both in and then just absolutely crawled up that like it wasn't even there. Now for descent, you've got two weapons in your armoury. The first one is low range, the second one is hill descent control. And with low range, the thing about a Grenadier is you've got a really, really good deep low range. I did a comparison of Grenadier versus LC300 versus Patrol versus Defender, and it was embarrassing to the other manufacturers how good the Grenadier was and how slow it could come down the hill. So don't be locked into thinking I've always got to use first low to come down a hill. Second low might be perfectly fine, in many cases even third low. So consider that. And add the lockers if required. There's my video where I explain why using a locker coming downhill can be hugely advantageous. And often all you're going to need is just select a low gear and a little bit of brake modulation, and that's it. If it is rutted, then add the lockers as well. So when would you use hill descent control? Well, really, my favourite use case for that is slippery descents. That's when all four wheels are on very slippery terrain, like extremely wet grass or something like that. Not sand, because sand digs in. You've actually got good traction in sand, but it's soft to dig in. So muddy, slippery, grassy descents where any touch of any wheel or the brakes is likely to slide. That's when you use hill descent control. If it's just rutted, lockers and low range I think is better. All right, now let's summarise some advice here. So I'm talking about people that might be used to driving Land Cruisers, Utes, or even Defenders. You're coming into a Grenadier. Here's a summary. So the first thing is lock that centre diff early and always on hills. Really want to emphasise that. The second is low range is really low, and it's got really good engine braking, so do make sure that you use that. And the vehicle actually defaults in low range to a second gear pull away, which I think is the correct decision. But remember, if you want to go even slower than that, and you might need to do that if you're just manoeuvring somewhere to get the vehicle right over a tree root or off a top of a rock or whatever, you can go to first gear because it will default into second. Conversely, if you are on a very slippery terrain like ice, for example, then knock it up into third and it will pull away in third low as opposed to second, less chance of wheel spin. So remember, you've got that flexibility, and you can actually pull away in second high as well, which is useful. Remember, you've got your off-road mode and especially the wade mode, that's important. Axle flex. Now, the Grenadier's actually got really good axle flex because most people these days drive independent suspension vehicles at the front, and that's not great. The Grenadier's the opposite. So lines which you would take in a Ranger, for example, and you'd lift wheels, you actually have all four wheels on the ground with the Grenadier. So that's a change. You know, the Grenadier starts to open up more choice of lines because it's got that axle flex, and it still retains good clearance even when the axles are flexed up. Now, the brake traction control is poor. Now, this is a disadvantage of the car. If you're used to driving something like a 200 series, you're coming along there, as soon as there's diagonal wheels in the air, the electronics just kick in and then you just chug along. That will not be the case in the Grenadier. So my recommendation there is pop that rear locker in if there's any chance of a wheel or a wheel starting to slip, and then you should be good to go. Left foot braking works, so you can place your left foot on the brake, bring the revs up and move off. That's handy for hill starts and lowering yourself down over rocks. I've used that technique quite a bit, but do not use that as a means of traction control. Anytime a vehicle's got brake traction control, do not do the poor man's locker technique with left foot braking. And use lockers for rutted high traction descents and hill descent control for slippery descents. And the winch does have a winch, but remember there's limitations, and I think the engine's got to be running. There's a few other limitations there, and it's only 15 metres, so figure all that out before you try to winch yourself out of a muddy creek. And finally, the centre diff can be unlocked in low range, which can be useful in some situations. Remember, you've got that trick up your sleeve as well. All right, now finally, a message to the world. I said, okay, what message do you want to send to the world as INEOS? And here's the clarification. So it's the standard one, as outlined in INEOS Automotive's latest brand campaign. The Grenadier is built for more. So maybe this is different from built for purpose, built for more purpose. Don't know. I'm not in marketing, if you hadn't already figured out. This is a call to drivers to get off their sofa. So if you're watching this on your sofa, INEOS would like you to get off it. Break free from the confines of the digital devices after you finish watching this, and embrace, probably not literally, what the outdoor world has to offer. The Grenadier is a go anywhere 4x4 engineered to world-class standards, can't really argue with that, and literally built for more of what this world has to offer. So that is INEOS's closing message to the world. Hope you enjoyed it and this video. Any questions, please use the comment section, and thank you for watching.